The autumn air in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter's approach. October 15, 1895 would be remembered as the day the Millbrook Cubs brought home their first county championship trophy, defeating the Harrisburg Eagles in a nail-biting final game that had the entire town on the edge of their seats. Thomas Murphy wiped the sweat from his dirt-streaked face as he clutched his worn leather glove, still unable to believe they had actually won. At 10 years old, he was the youngest player on the team, but his quick reflexes and steady batting had earned him respect among his older teammates. The other boys gathered around their coach, Mr. Samuel Hartwell, their voices echoing across the empty field as they celebrated their victory. "Boys, boys," Mr. Hartwell called out, his weathered hands gesturing for attention. "Mr. Aldrich here wants to take our picture for the town newspaper. Line up now and make your families proud." Edgar Aldrich, the town's only photographer, was already setting up his bulky camera equipment near home plate, his black cloth draped over the wooden tripod as he adjusted the brass lens with practiced precision. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field, and Thomas noticed how the dying light seemed to make everything look slightly different, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The 10 boys arranged themselves in 2 neat rows, their uniforms dusty and torn from the intense game. Thomas found himself in the front row, kneeling beside his best friend, Jimmy Patterson. Behind them stood the older boys, Robert Chen, whose family had moved from San Francisco just 2 years prior, the Sullivan twins, Patrick and Michael, known for their identical batting stances, David Kowalski, the team's catcher, Benjamin Hayes, their pitcher, Samuel Morrison, the team's captain, and, finally, Joseph Wagner and Timothy O'Brien, the outfielders who had made the game-winning catch. "Hold perfectly still now," Mr. Aldrich instructed, his voice muffled by the black cloth. "This exposure will take nearly 30 seconds. Don't move a muscle, or you'll appear as ghosts in the photograph." The irony of his words would not be lost on them later. Thomas felt the weight of the moment as he tried to remain motionless, his eyes focused straight ahead at the camera lens. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of families packing up their picnic blankets and the creak of Mr. Aldrich's equipment. Something felt different about this moment, though Thomas couldn't quite place what it was. There was an odd chill in the air despite the warm afternoon, and he could have sworn he heard an extra set of breathing among his teammates. "Excellent," Mr. Aldrich finally announced, emerging from beneath his cloth. "That should make a fine photograph for the front page of the Millbrook Gazette." The boys immediately broke formation, their excited chatter returning as they gathered their equipment and prepared to head home. Thomas lingered for a moment, looking back at the field where they had just made history. The sun was setting behind the old oak trees that bordered the property, and long shadows stretched across the diamond like reaching fingers. "Tommy!" his mother's voice called from the sidelines. "Come along now, your father wants to hear every detail about the game." As Thomas jogged toward his family, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been different during those 30 seconds of stillness. He glanced back once more at the empty field, now bathed in the golden light of dusk, but saw nothing unusual. Just the familiar diamond where he had spent countless hours practicing with his teammates. 3 days later, Mr. Aldrich's developed photograph appeared in the window of Peterson's general store, mounted on a small easel for all the town to admire. Thomas pressed his face against the glass, eager to see how the picture had turned out. The image was crisp and clear, showing all 10 members of the Millbrook Cubs in their moment of triumph. But as Thomas studied the photograph more carefully, his blood began to run cold. There, standing in the back row between Samuel Morrison and Joseph Wagner, was another boy, an 11th boy that Thomas had never seen before in his life. The stranger appeared to be about the same age as the rest of them, wearing a similar uniform, but his face was somehow different from the others. While his teammates smiled proudly at the camera, this boy's expression was unnaturally solemn, his dark eyes seeming to stare directly out of the photograph with an intensity that made Thomas's skin crawl. "Ma," Thomas whispered, tugging at his mother's sleeve as she examined some fabric nearby. "Ma, look at this picture. Who is that boy?" Margaret Murphy approached the window and studied the photograph carefully, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't know, dear. Perhaps it's one of the boys from the other team who wandered into the picture." But Thomas knew that wasn't right. The boy was clearly wearing a Millbrook uniform, and he was positioned perfectly among the team members, as if he belonged there. More disturbing still, Thomas was absolutely certain that no 11th boy had been present during the photograph session. He remembered every moment of that day with crystal clarity, and there had only been 10 players on their team. As word of the mysterious photograph spread through Millbrook, curious townspeople gathered outside Peterson's store to examine the image for themselves. The consensus was unanimous and deeply unsettling. Nobody could identify the 11th boy, despite the fact that Millbrook was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's children. Word of the mysterious photograph spread through Millbrook like wildfire over the next few days. Thomas found himself the center of attention wherever he went, with neighbors and strangers alike approaching him with questions about the unknown boy. Each conversation left him more unsettled than the last. "Thomas, dear," Mrs. Henderson called out as he walked past her white picket fence on his way to school. She was hanging laundry on the line, but her eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I've been looking at that photograph every day, and I swear that boy's face looks different each time. Yesterday I could have sworn he was smiling, but today he looks so very sad." Thomas stopped in his tracks, his schoolbooks clutched tightly against his chest. "What do you mean, ma'am?" "Come here and tell me honestly," she said, beckoning him closer with a wet bedsheet in her hands. "Do you truly not remember another boy being there that day?" "No, ma'am. I'm certain there were only 10 of us. I know every boy on the team, and I've never seen that face before in my life." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew troubled as she pinned the sheet to the line. "My late husband used to tell stories about photographs capturing things that weren't meant to be captured. Said cameras could sometimes see into places we weren't supposed to look." The old woman's words sent a chill down Thomas's spine, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. "That's just superstition, Mrs. Henderson. There has to be a reasonable explanation." But as Thomas continued his walk to school, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in Millbrook. The very air seemed heavier somehow, and he noticed that many of the townspeople appeared on edge. Conversation stopped abruptly when he approached, and he caught fragments of worried whispers about the photograph, about strange dreams, and about children behaving oddly. At Millbrook Elementary School, Thomas's teacher, Miss Catherine Reynolds, had arranged for the class to discuss their recent victory and the mysterious photograph. She was a stern but fair woman in her mid-30s, known for her no-nonsense approach to education and her intolerance for foolish superstitions. "Now, children," Miss Reynolds began, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles as she addressed the classroom. "I'm sure you've all heard the gossip about Thomas's baseball photograph. I want to discuss this rationally and put an end to the wild stories that are circulating through our town." Thomas squirmed in his wooden desk as every pair of eyes in the classroom turned toward him. His teammates Jimmy Patterson, Robert Chen, and David Kowalski were scattered throughout the room, looking equally uncomfortable with the attention. "Miss Reynolds," raised the hand of Mary Elizabeth Porter, a freckled girl with pigtails who sat in the front row. "My mama says the photograph shows a dead boy who's trying to steal the souls of the living players." Several children gasped, and Miss Reynolds rapped her ruler sharply against her desk. "Mary Elizabeth, that is exactly the kind of nonsensical talk I will not tolerate in my classroom. Photographs are scientific instruments that capture reality, nothing more." But Thomas noticed that even Miss Reynolds seemed troubled as she continued her lecture. Her usually steady voice wavered slightly, and she kept glancing toward the window that faced the direction of Peterson's general store. During recess, Thomas gathered with his teammates behind the schoolhouse, away from the curious ears of their classmates. The autumn wind rustled through the maple trees above them, sending yellow and orange leaves spiraling down around their feet. "I went back to look at the photograph again yesterday," Jimmy Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear that boy was looking in a different direction than he was the day before." Robert Chen shook his head emphatically. "That's impossible, Jimmy. Photographs don't change." "Then how do you explain it?" David Kowalski challenged. "How do you explain a boy that none of us remember being there, wearing our uniform, standing right there with us like he belonged?" Thomas felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders. As the youngest member of the team, he had always looked up to these boys, but now they were all looking to him for answers he didn't have. "Maybe we should ask Mr. Aldrich about it," Thomas suggested. He took the photograph. If anyone would know how this could have happened, it would be him. The other boys exchanged glances, and Thomas could see both hope and fear in their expressions. They all wanted answers, but they were also terrified of what those answers might be. That evening, after completing his chores and finishing his arithmetic homework, Thomas convinced his parents to let him walk to Mr. Aldrich's photography studio on Main Street. The sun was setting behind the hills that surrounded Millbrook, casting long shadows between the buildings and giving the familiar streets an ominous appearance. Edgar Aldrich's studio occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building wedged between the town's only barber shop and a small haberdashery. Thomas climbed the creaking wooden stairs, his heart pounding with each step. The hallway smelled of chemical solutions and something else he couldn't identify, something that reminded him of old flowers left too long in stagnant water. He knocked hesitantly on the frosted glass door, marked E. Aldrich, Photography. "Come in," came a weary voice from inside. Thomas pushed open the door and found Mr. Aldrich hunched over a work table covered with photographic plates and bottles of developing solution. The photographer looked up, and Thomas was startled by how much older the man appeared than he had just a few days earlier. Deep lines creased his forehead, and his usually neat mustache was disheveled. "Ah, young Murphy," Mr. Aldrich said, setting down his magnifying glass. "I suppose you've come about the photograph." "Yes, sir, I was hoping you might be able to explain how that extra boy appeared in our picture." Mr. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently straightening the photographs scattered across his workspace. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for a simple explanation. "Thomas, in all my years of taking photographs, I've never encountered anything like this. I've examined that plate under every lens I own, and I can find no evidence of double exposure or any other technical error. That boy appears to have been standing right there with your team, as real as any of you." The photographer paused, then reached into a drawer and pulled out the original photographic plate. "But here's what truly disturbs me, son. I've been developing photographs for over 20 years, and I've never seen an image that seems to change depending on when you look at it." Thomas stared at the photographic plate in Mr. Aldrich's trembling hands, his mouth suddenly dry as cotton. The glass negative showed the same image as the printed photograph, but somehow seeing it in its original form made the mystery feel even more real and terrifying. "What do you mean it changes?" Thomas asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Mr. Aldrich set the plate down carefully and rubbed his tired eyes. "I first noticed it 2 days ago when I was making additional prints for the newspaper. I could have sworn the unknown boy's head was turned slightly to the left, looking toward your friend Jimmy. But when I checked again later that evening, he appeared to be staring straight ahead at the camera." The photographer walked to a cabinet and retrieved several prints of the same photograph, laying them out side by side on his work table. "I've been making a print each day, thinking perhaps I was losing my mind. But look at these, Thomas. Really look at them." Thomas leaned over the photographs, studying each one carefully. At first glance they appeared identical, but as he focused on the mysterious 11th boy, subtle differences became apparent. In the first print, the boy's expression was neutral, almost blank. In the second, there seemed to be the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The third showed him with a more serious expression, and in the most recent print, the boy appeared to be looking directly at whoever was viewing the photograph. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered, his hands shaking as he picked up one of the prints. "People don't move in photographs." "That's what I've believed my entire career," Mr. Aldrich replied, sinking into a wooden chair. "But I can no longer deny what I'm seeing. And there's something else, something that frightens me even more than the changing expressions." The photographer reached for a magnifying glass and held it over the most recent print. "Look closely at the boy's eyes in this one. Tell me what you see." Thomas peered through the magnifying glass, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. The mysterious boy's eyes were not looking at the camera or at any fixed point in the distance. Instead, they appeared to be focused directly on Thomas himself, as if the boy in the photograph could somehow see him looking back. "That's not possible," Thomas stammered, stepping away from the table. "That's not possible at all." "I've shown this to 3 other people today," Mr. Aldrich said gravely. "Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Williams, and Father McKenna from the Catholic Church. Each one of them swore the boy was looking directly at them when they examined the photograph." Thomas felt dizzy, and he gripped the edge of the work table to steady himself. "What does it mean? What does he want?" "I don't know, son, but I've been having the most disturbing dreams since I developed this photograph. Dreams of children playing baseball in a field I don't recognize, under a sky that's the wrong color, and in every dream, that same boy is there, watching me, trying to tell me something I can't understand." The room felt suddenly colder, and Thomas noticed that the oil lamps seemed to flicker despite the absence of any wind. He wanted to leave, to run home to his parents, and pretend none of this was happening, but he knew he needed answers. "Mr. Aldrich, have you ever heard of anything like this happening before? With photographs, I mean." The older man was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkening street below. "My grandfather was a photographer in the early days, back in the 1840s. He used to tell stories about images that captured more than they should, about photographs that seemed to open windows into places that weren't meant to be seen by the living. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of places? Places where the dead wait, according to him. Places where souls get lost between this world and whatever comes next. Mr. Aldrich turned back to Thomas, his face grave in the lamplight. He always said that cameras were like mirrors, and mirrors have always been doorways for things that shouldn't exist in our world. Outside, the town church bell began to toll the evening hour, its deep bronze voice echoing through the empty streets. Thomas counted the chimes, realizing with a start that it was later than he had thought. His parents would be worried if he didn't return home soon. "I should go," Thomas said, but he found himself reluctant to leave the safety of the photographer's studio. Despite the frightening revelations, being here with Mr. Aldrich felt safer than facing the dark streets alone. "Wait," Mr. Aldrich said, reaching for a small leather portfolio. "I want you to take one of these prints with you. Study it carefully, but don't let your parents see it. Not yet. I have a feeling this mystery is far from over, and you may need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Thomas accepted the photograph with trembling hands, folding it carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket. "What should I do with it?" "Watch it. Document any changes you observe, and Thomas," Mr. Aldrich placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, "if you start having strange dreams, or if you see that boy anywhere other than in the photograph, come to me immediately. Don't try to handle this alone." As Thomas descended the creaking stairs and stepped out onto Main Street, he could feel the weight of the photograph in his pocket like a stone. The gas streetlights cast eerie circles of yellow light along the sidewalk, creating pools of illumination separated by stretches of impenetrable darkness. He hurried through the night, his footsteps echoing off the wooden storefronts, trying not to think about Mr. Aldrich's warnings about dreams and doorways. But as he passed Peterson's general store, he couldn't resist glancing toward the window where the original photograph was still displayed. Even in the dim reflection of the streetlight, Thomas could see the image clearly. And there, in the back row among his teammates, the mysterious 11th boy seemed to be watching him walk by, his dark eyes following Thomas's movement along the sidewalk. Thomas broke into a run, not stopping until he reached the warm, welcoming light spilling from his family's kitchen window. But even as he burst through the front door and into his mother's concerned embrace, he could still feel those strange, impossible eyes boring into his back from somewhere in the darkness behind him. That night, Thomas lay in his small bedroom under the eaves of his family's two-story house, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the familiar sounds of Millbrook settling into sleep. The photograph lay hidden beneath his mattress, but he could feel its presence as if it were radiating some kind of cold energy through the floorboards and into his bones. Despite his exhaustion from the day's revelations, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mysterious boy's changing expressions, the way those dark eyes seemed to follow his movements. The autumn wind rattled his bedroom window, and shadows danced across the walls in patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost alive. When sleep finally claimed him near midnight, Thomas found himself standing in a vast, empty baseball field, unlike any he had ever seen. The grass was a sickly yellow-green color, and the sky above was a deep burgundy that reminded him of dried blood. In the distance, he could hear the sound of children laughing and playing, but the voices seemed to come from underground. He walked toward home plate, his bare feet making no sound on the strange grass. The field stretched impossibly far in all directions, with no visible boundaries or fence lines. As he approached the pitcher's mound, he saw them, 11 boys in baseball uniforms, arranged in the same formation as his team's championship photograph. But these were not his teammates. The faces were wrong, distorted in ways that made Thomas's stomach churn. Their eyes were too large and completely black, their smiles too wide, stretching beyond the natural limits of human anatomy. And standing in the center of the group, exactly where Thomas remembered positioning himself for the photograph, was the mysterious 11th boy from the image. Unlike the others, this boy looked completely normal, exactly as he appeared in the photograph. He beckoned to Thomas with a pale, thin hand, his mouth moving as if he were speaking, but no sound emerged from his lips. "Who are you?" Thomas called out, but his own voice sounded muffled and distant in the strange atmosphere of the dream field. The boy's mouth continued to move silently, his expression growing more urgent. He pointed to something behind Thomas, and when the dreaming boy turned around, he saw his own house in Millbrook, but it was wrong somehow. The windows were boarded up with rotting planks, and the front porch was overgrown with thorny vines that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Thomas tried to run toward his home, but his legs felt like they were moving through thick mud. The mysterious boy's voice finally reached him, carried on the burgundy wind like whispers from a grave. "Help us. Help us find our way home." Thomas woke with a gasp, his nightshirt soaked with sweat despite the cool October air. The room was still dark, but he could see the faint outline of dawn beginning to creep around the edges of his curtains. He reached under his mattress and pulled out the photograph, his hands trembling as he held it up to catch the dim light. The mysterious boy's expression had changed again. Now he looked sad, almost pleading, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he were in the middle of speaking the same words Thomas had heard in his dream. A soft knock at his bedroom door made Thomas quickly shove the photograph back under his mattress. His mother peered in, her face creased with concern. "Thomas, dear, are you all right? I heard you calling out in your sleep." "I'm fine, Ma," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a bad dream." Margaret Murphy stepped into the room and sat on the edge of his bed, placing a cool hand on his forehead. "You don't feel feverish, but you look terribly pale. Perhaps you should stay home from school today." "No, I'm fine, really. I need to talk to Jimmy and the other boys about something important." His mother studied his face carefully, and Thomas could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "This is about that photograph, isn't it? Thomas, I want you to stop worrying about it. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation." But Thomas could hear the uncertainty in her voice, and he wondered if she had been having strange dreams too. He noticed dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the day before, and her usually steady hands seemed to tremble slightly as she smoothed his blankets. After his mother left for her morning chores, Thomas dressed quickly and examined the photograph one more time before tucking it securely into his jacket pocket. The mysterious boy now appeared to be looking directly at him again, but there was something different about his expression. Where before there had been sadness or pleading, now Thomas detected what looked like urgency, even desperation. At breakfast, Thomas noticed that his father was unusually quiet, picking at his eggs and bacon without his usual hearty appetite. William Murphy was a practical man who worked at the town's lumber mill, not given to flights of fancy or superstitious thinking. But this morning, he kept glancing toward the kitchen window, as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. "Pa," Thomas ventured carefully, "did you sleep well last night?" His father looked up sharply, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "Why do you ask, son? You look tired, is all." William Murphy set down his fork and rubbed his temples. "Had the strangest dream, actually. Dreamed I was back in the old country, in the village where my grandfather lived before he came to America. But all the children were gone, and there was this boy standing in the town square trying to tell me something I couldn't understand." Thomas felt his appetite disappear completely. "What did the boy look like, Pa?" "Dark hair, maybe 10 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they were from 50 years ago. Kept pointing toward the cemetery and moving his mouth like he was talking, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of church bells that never stopped ringing." The description sent ice through Thomas's veins. It was too similar to his own dream to be a coincidence, and too specific to be dismissed as mere imagination. He excused himself from the table and hurried toward school, desperate to find his teammates and discover if they had experienced similar nightmares. He found Jimmy Patterson waiting by the schoolhouse steps, looking as haggard and frightened as Thomas felt. Dark circles shadowed the older boy's eyes, and his usually neat hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Jimmy," Thomas called out, jogging across the schoolyard, "did you have strange dreams last night?" Jimmy's face went pale and he grabbed Thomas by the shoulders. "You had them too. The baseball field with the wrong sky and that boy trying to talk to us. You saw him too?" "I saw him, Tommy, and I heard him at the very end. He said something about finding their way home, about being lost between worlds." Jimmy's voice dropped to a terrified whisper, "And when I woke up, I found dirt under my fingernails, even though I went to bed with clean hands." Thomas felt his legs go weak. He pulled out the photograph and showed it to Jimmy, watching his friend's face turn even paler as he saw the mysterious boy's changed expression. "It's getting worse," Jimmy whispered. "Whatever this is, it's getting stronger." By noon that day, Thomas and Jimmy had gathered with the rest of their teammates behind the schoolhouse during lunch recess. The October wind had grown stronger, sending dead leaves swirling around their feet in miniature cyclones that seemed to follow unnatural patterns. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, promising the first serious storm of the season. Robert Chen was the first to speak, his usually calm demeanor shattered by obvious fear. "I couldn't sleep at all last night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw that same baseball field, but it wasn't right. The grass was the wrong color and there were children playing, but their faces, he shuddered. Their faces weren't human anymore. David Kowalski nodded grimly. I saw them too. And that boy from the photograph was there trying to tell us something. When I woke up this morning, my mother found me standing in our backyard in my nightclothes, facing toward the old cemetery on Elm Street. The Sullivan twins, Patrick and Michael, exchanged a meaningful glance before Patrick spoke up. We both had the same dream, at the exact same time. Ma found us in the morning, both of us sleepwalking toward the front door. We would have walked right out into the street if she hadn't stopped us. Benjamin Hayes, their pitcher, was trembling as he pulled a small object from his pocket. I found this clutched in my hand when I woke up, he said, opening his palm to reveal a small tarnished brass button. It's not from any of my clothes, and I've never seen it before in my life. Thomas examined the button closely. It was clearly old, much older than anything any of them would own, and bore a strange symbol that looked like a tree with roots that extended impossibly deep. The metal felt unnaturally cold against his skin, and he noticed that it seemed to grow even colder when he brought it near the photograph in his jacket pocket. We need to figure out what's happening to us, Thomas said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. This isn't just coincidence anymore. Something is trying to communicate with us through that photograph, and it's getting stronger every day. Samuel Morrison, their team captain, had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion. Now he stepped forward, his face grave. There's something else, something I haven't told any of you yet. He paused, looking around at each of his teammates. My grandmother came to visit us last night. She's lived in Millbrook her entire life, almost 80 years now. When I told her about the photograph and the dreams, she went white as a sheet. The boys gathered closer, sensing that Samuel had crucial information. She told me about something that happened in 1845, exactly 50 years ago. There was a baseball team then too, boys about our age. They were practicing for a big game against a team from the next county when something terrible happened. Thomas felt his stomach drop. What kind of terrible thing? A storm came up suddenly, one of those freak October storms that can turn deadly without warning. The boys were caught out in the open field when lightning started striking. All 10 of them were killed instantly, right there on the same field where we play. The wind around them seemed to grow colder, and Thomas noticed that the other children playing in the schoolyard had moved farther away, as if some instinct warned them to keep their distance from the baseball team. But here's the part that really scared my grandmother, Samuel continued. She said that for weeks after the boys died, people in town reported seeing them still playing baseball on that field, always at dusk, always when the light was just starting to fade, and there was always an 11th boy with them, a boy nobody could identify. Joseph Wagner, one of their outfielders, spoke up in a shaky voice. How you think that's what we're seeing? The ghosts of that team from 50 years ago. I think that 11th boy has been trying to join teams for 50 years, Thomas said, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place in his mind. I think he's been trapped somehow, unable to move on like the others, and he's been waiting for another team to help him. Timothy O'Brien, their other outfielder, looked skeptical despite his obvious fear. But why us? Why now? Thomas pulled out the photograph and studied it carefully. The mysterious boy's expression had changed again, and now he looked almost hopeful, as if he knew they were beginning to understand. Look at the date we won our championship, Thomas said suddenly. October 15th, 1895. Exactly 50 years to the day after those boys died. The realization hit them all simultaneously, and several of the boys stepped back as if the photograph itself might be dangerous. So what does he want from us? David asked. What are we supposed to do? Before Thomas could answer, a commotion from the direction of the school building caught their attention. Miss Reynolds was hurrying across the schoolyard toward them, her usually composed face showing signs of panic. "Boys!" she called out, her voice carrying an urgency that made them all straighten up. "You need to come inside immediately. There's been an incident involving several of your families." Thomas's heart began to race. "What kind of incident, Miss Reynolds?" "Your parents have been gathering at Peterson's store all morning, staring at that photograph. Dr. Williams says some of them have been standing there for hours without moving, without responding when people try to talk to them." She paused, catching her breath. "And Thomas, your mother specifically asked for you. She says she needs to tell you something important about your grandfather's old photographs." The boys exchanged frightened glances, but before any of them could respond, the first drops of rain began to fall from the darkening sky above. The storm was coming, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a weather phenomenon. As they hurried toward the school building, Thomas heard Jimmy whisper behind him, "The boy in the photograph isn't the only one trying to communicate with us anymore. I think the other 10 are waking up too." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Thomas remembered Samuel's story about the lightning that had killed the original team. He clutched the photograph in his pocket, feeling the cold metal of Benjamin's mysterious button pressing against his other hand, and wondered if they were about to face the same fate as the boys who had died 50 years ago to the day. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the school windows like desperate fingers trying to get inside. The rain was falling steadily by the time Thomas and his teammates reached Peterson's general store. What they found there filled them with a dread that went beyond anything they had experienced in their nightmares. Nearly 24 adults stood motionless in front of the store window, their faces pressed close to the glass, staring at the championship photograph with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Thomas immediately spotted his mother among the crowd, her usually vibrant face pale and expressionless. She stood perfectly still, her breath fogging the glass as she gazed at the image. Beside her, Jimmy's father swayed slightly on his feet, as if he were fighting against some invisible force trying to pull him closer to the photograph. "Ma!" Thomas called out, pushing through the crowd of silent adults. "Ma, what's wrong?" Margaret Murphy didn't respond immediately. When she finally turned toward her son, her eyes had a distant, unfocused quality that made Thomas's blood run cold. It was as if she were looking through him rather than at him. "Thomas," she said, in a voice that sounded hollow and strange, "your grandfather's photographs, the ones in the attic, you need to see them." "What about grandfather's photographs, Ma?" "He took pictures of that team, the one that died, all of them." Her words came out in a disconnected monotone. "But there was always an extra boy in those pictures too. Always 11, never 10. Dr. Williams, the town physician, approached the group of boys with obvious concern etched on his weathered face. He was one of the few adults who seemed unaffected by whatever force was drawing people to the photograph. "Boys, I need you to help me get these people away from this window," he said urgently. "They've been standing here for hours, some of them since dawn." Mrs. Patterson collapsed earlier from dehydration, and Mr. Sullivan is showing signs of exposure despite his heavy coat. Thomas looked around at the crowd and realized with growing horror that every single person staring at the photograph was the parent or relative of someone connected to the current baseball team. It was as if the mysterious boy was calling to their families, trying to use them to reach the players themselves. "Dr. Williams," Thomas said, pulling the photograph from his pocket, "I need to show you something." The doctor took the image and examined it carefully, his medical training evident in his methodical approach. But as he studied the mysterious 11th boy, his professional composure began to crack. "This is impossible," he muttered. "I've looked at this photograph dozens of times over the past week, and I could swear this boy's expression keeps changing." "It does change," Jimmy said. "We've all seen it, and we've all been having the same dreams." Dr. Williams looked up sharply. "What kind of dreams?" Thomas quickly explained their shared experiences. The strange baseball field, the distorted faces of the other children, and the mysterious boy's apparent attempts to communicate with them. As he spoke, he noticed that several of the adults in the crowd were turning their heads slightly, as if they were listening to his words, while still keeping their eyes fixed on the photograph. "And you found this?" Dr. Williams asked, examining the brass button that Benjamin had discovered. "Clutched in my hand when I woke up," Benjamin confirmed, "along with dirt under my fingernails, even though I went to bed with clean hands." The doctor's face grew increasingly troubled as he processed this information. "Boys, I think you're dealing with something far beyond my medical expertise, but I have a theory about what might be happening." He gestured toward the crowd of entranced adults. "In my medical training, I studied cases of mass hysteria and collective unconscious phenomena. Sometimes, when a traumatic event occurs in a specific location, it can leave what some researchers call a psychic imprint. That imprint can be activated under certain circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Robert asked. "Strong emotional connections, for one. You boys winning your championship on the exact anniversary of the original team's death created a powerful link. Add to that the fact that you're the same age as the boys who died, playing the same sport on the same field." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain began to fall harder against the store windows. Thomas noticed that the rhythm of the raindrops seemed almost purposeful, like a coded message being tapped out by invisible fingers. "Dr. Williams," Thomas said suddenly, "my mother mentioned my grandfather's photographs. She said he took pictures of the team that died, and they always showed 11 boys instead of 10. Your grandfather was the town photographer before Mr. Aldrich, the doctor replied. If anyone documented that tragedy, it would have been him. Thomas felt a surge of determination despite his fear. We need to see those photographs. If the same boy has been appearing in pictures for 50 years, maybe we can figure out who he was and what he wants. I'll come with you, Dr. Williams said, but first we need to get these people away from this window before they suffer serious harm. It took nearly an hour to coax the entranced adults away from Peterson's store. They moved reluctantly, like sleepwalkers being forcibly awakened, and several of them kept trying to turn back toward the photograph. Thomas's mother seemed particularly affected, reaching out toward the window even as he and Dr. Williams guided her away. By the time they reached the Murphy house, the storm had intensified considerably. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind howled through the trees with a sound that reminded Thomas uncomfortably of children crying. His mother led them to the attic with mechanical movements, pointing toward a dusty trunk in the far corner. "His photographs are in there," she said in that same hollow voice, "all of them, including the ones he was never supposed to take." Thomas opened the trunk with trembling hands, revealing stacks of photographic plates and prints dating back decades. Near the bottom, he found a collection of images that made his heart stop. They showed the baseball team from 1845, the boys who had died in the lightning storm. But just as his mother had said, every single photograph showed 11 players instead of 10, and standing among them, unchanged by the passage of 50 years, was the same mysterious boy who had appeared in their championship picture. In some of the photographs, the boy appeared to be in the middle of speaking. In others, he was pointing towards something outside the frame. But in the final image, taken just days before the team's death, the mysterious boy was looking directly at the camera with an expression of pure terror. Scrawled on the back of this last photograph, in his grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "God help me, I think I know what he's trying to warn us about." The wind rattled the attic windows as Thomas carefully turned over the photograph, reading his grandfather's ominous message aloud. "Doctor." Williams leaned closer, his face grave in the flickering light of the oil lamp they had brought up from downstairs. "Your grandfather knew something," the doctor said quietly, "something he was afraid to put into words." Thomas's mother stood near the attic stairs, still wearing that distant expression, but her eyes seemed slightly more focused now that they were away from the store window. "He used to have terrible nightmares after taking those pictures," she said suddenly. "He would wake up screaming about children calling for help from beneath the ground." Dr. Williams and Thomas exchanged a meaningful look. "Mrs. Murphy, did your father ever say anything specific about what the mysterious boy was trying to warn them about?" Margaret Murphy pressed her fingers to her temples, as if trying to force herself to remember. "He said the boy wasn't trying to join the team. He was trying to save them, but nobody would listen, and they all died anyway." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Save them from what?" "From him," came a weak voice from the corner of the attic. They turned to see Thomas's father climbing the stairs, his face pale and drawn, "from the thing that killed them all." William Murphy entered the attic space, moving like a man much older than his years. "I remember my father-in-law's stories, though I never believed them until now. He said that boy in the photographs wasn't a ghost. He was a warning." "A warning about what, Pa?" Thomas's father sat heavily on an old wooden crate, his hands trembling as he spoke. "About something that feeds on the energy of young lives, something that uses storms and lightning to harvest souls. Your grandfather believed that the mysterious boy was the spirit of a child who had been killed by this entity years before, trying to warn other children to stay away from the field during storms." Doctor Williams frowned, his scientific mind struggling with the supernatural explanations. "But that doesn't explain why the boy is appearing in photographs now, 50 years later." Thomas was studying the photographs more carefully, examining each image under the lamplight. "Look at the dates on these," he said suddenly. "Grandfather took pictures of that team for 3 weeks leading up to their death, and in every picture, the mysterious boy looks more and more frightened." He arranged the photographs in chronological order, and the progression was unmistakable. In the earliest images, the unknown boy appeared calm, almost resigned. But as the dates approached October 15, 1845, his expression grew increasingly desperate and fearful. "It's like he knew what was going to happen," Jimmy observed, having climbed up to join them despite the storm raging outside. "Like he was trying harder and harder to warn them, but they couldn't see him." Thomas's blood ran cold as a new realization hit him. What if he's not trying to join our team? What if he's trying to warn us about the same thing that killed the boys 50 years ago? As if summoned by his words, A tremendous crack of thunder shook the entire house, followed immediately by a lightning flash so bright it turned the attic windows white for several seconds. In that moment of intense illumination, Thomas could have sworn he saw a figure standing in the yard below, a small boy in an old-fashioned baseball uniform, pointing frantically toward the sky. "Did you see that?" Thomas gasped, rushing to the window. But when his vision cleared, the yard was empty except for the storm-bent trees and the driving rain. Dr. Williams was examining another photograph, this one apparently taken after the team's death. "Your grandfather documented the aftermath as well," he said grimly. "Look at this." The image showed the baseball field on the morning after the lightning storm. The bodies of the 10 boys were arranged in an almost perfect circle around home plate, but something about the scene was wrong. The grass within the circle was completely dead, burned black in a pattern that extended far beyond what could be explained by lightning strikes. "That's not natural," Dr. Williams murmured. "Lightning doesn't create patterns like that." Thomas found another photograph taken from a different angle, and what he saw made his blood freeze. In the center of the circle of dead grass, barely visible in the old image, was what appeared to be a dark opening in the ground, as if the earth itself had been torn open. "My God," Thomas whispered. "Something came up through the ground." His father nodded slowly. "Your grandfather believed that the field was cursed, that it was a thin place between our world and something else. He thought the storms were just a way for the entity to cross over and feed." Outside, the storm was growing more intense by the minute. Lightning was striking with increasing frequency, and Thomas noticed that many of the flashes seemed to be centered around the area where the old baseball field was located. "The same thing is happening again," Thomas said, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "It's coming back on the anniversary, just like it did 50 years ago." Dr. Williams stood up abruptly, his medical bag clutched in his hand. "Then we need to make sure no children are anywhere near that field tonight. If this entity feeds on young lives, and if the storm is how it manifests in our world—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the implications. Thomas gathered up the photographs, his hands shaking as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. The mysterious boy has been trying to warn baseball teams for 50 years, but nobody could see him except in photographs. Now he's gotten strong enough to reach us through our dreams, to affect our families, to make himself seen. "Because we're the first team to win a championship on the exact anniversary," Jimmy added, "we created a stronger connection than ever before." Another massive lightning strike illuminated the attic, and this time they all saw it clearly. The figure of a boy standing in the yard, his mouth open in a silent scream of warning, pointing desperately toward the old baseball field, where the storm clouds were gathering with unnatural density. Thomas looked at the final photograph his grandfather had taken, the one with the terrified expression and the ominous message on the back. Suddenly he understood what his grandfather had discovered and why it had filled him with such dread. "He's not just trying to warn us about the entity," Thomas said, his voice hollow with realization. "He's trying to warn us that it's getting stronger. Each time it feeds, each time it takes a team of children, it grows more powerful. And tonight, on the 50th anniversary, it's strong enough to take more than just 10 boys." Through the storm-lashed windows, they could see lights flickering on throughout Millbrook as families gathered their children close, sensing on some primal level that this was no ordinary autumn storm. But Thomas knew it was already too late for many of them. The entity was awake and it was hungry. As if responding to Thomas's horrifying realization, the storm outside suddenly intensified beyond anything natural. Lightning began striking with machine-like regularity, each flash accompanied by thunder so powerful it shook the foundation of the house. Through the attic windows, they could see that the strikes were no longer random. They were all concentrated over the old baseball field, creating a pillar of electrical energy that reached from the ground to the storm clouds above. "We have to get to that field," Thomas said, surprising everyone, including himself, with his determination. "If the mysterious boy has been trying to warn teams for 50 years, and if we're the first ones who can actually see and hear him, then maybe we're the first ones who can actually do something about it." Dr. Williams shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. That field is the most dangerous place in Millbrook right now. Whatever this entity is, it's drawing power from the storm. Going there would be suicide. But if we don't go, it's going to take more children," Thomas argued. "You said yourself it's getting stronger. If it fed on 10 boys 50 years ago, how many do you think it can take now?" As if to emphasize his point, a child's scream echoed through the storm from somewhere in the distance. Then another, and another, until the wind seemed to carry the voices of dozens of terrified children all calling out at once. Margaret Murphy suddenly snapped out of her trance-like state, her eyes focusing with sharp clarity, for the first time since they had found her at Peterson's store. "Thomas, those voices aren't coming from the town," she said urgently. "They're coming from under the ground." The adults exchanged terrified glances as the implications sank in. The entity wasn't just preparing to feed, it was already calling to its victims, drawing them through some supernatural compulsion toward the field where it waited. "My God," Dr. Williams whispered, moving to the window. "Look at the street." Below them, children were emerging from houses throughout the neighborhood, walking with the same mechanical, trance-like movements they had observed in the adults earlier. The youngsters moved in perfect synchronization, all heading in the same direction, toward the old baseball field on the outskirts of town. Thomas recognized several of the children: Mary Elizabeth Porter from his class, the young Kowalski twins who couldn't be more than 6 years old, and at least a dozen others. They walked through the driving rain as if they didn't feel it, their nightclothes quickly becoming soaked, their bare feet splashing through puddles without any sign of discomfort. "It's calling them," Thomas's father said, his voice heavy with dread. "Just like it called the boys 50 years ago." Jimmy grabbed Thomas's arm. "Tommy, my little sister Sarah is down there. She's only 7 years old." Thomas could see Jimmy's sister among the procession of children, her blonde hair plastered to her head by the rain, her usually bright eyes now vacant and staring. The sight filled him with a rage that burned hotter than his fear. "That's it," Thomas declared, heading for the attic stairs. "I don't care how dangerous it is, we can't just sit here and watch it take them." Dr. Williams caught his arm. "Son, what do you think you can do against something that powerful? You're just children yourselves." "We're the only ones who can see the warning, boy," Thomas replied. "We're the only ones who understand what's really happening, and we're the only ones who aren't being affected by its call." As if to prove his point, the sound of more children could be heard throughout the town. Doors opening, parents calling out in alarm, and the shuffle of small feet joining the procession toward the field. The entity's influence was spreading rapidly, and with each new victim drawn into its web, the storm seemed to grow more violent. Thomas pulled out the photograph and looked at it one more time. The mysterious boy's expression had changed again, and now he appeared to be pleading, his mouth open in what looked like a desperate cry for help. But there was something else in the image now, something that made Thomas's heart race with hope. "Look," he said, showing the picture to the others. "He's not alone anymore." Behind the mysterious boy, barely visible in the photograph's shadows, were the ghostly outlines of 10 other children, the original baseball team that had died 50 years ago. They stood in formation behind their warning companion, and their expressions showed the same desperate urgency. "They're all trying to help," Thomas realized. "The whole team has been trying to warn us, but only one of them was strong enough to appear in photographs. Now, with the anniversary and the storm, they're all manifesting." Margaret Murphy suddenly grabbed her son's shoulders. "Thomas, your grandfather left something else in that trunk. Something he said to only use if the warnings were ever ignored." She dug frantically through the bottom of the old trunk, finally emerging with a small leather pouch tied with a black ribbon. Inside were 11 brass buttons, identical to the one Benjamin had found, but these were arranged in a specific pattern and wrapped in a piece of paper covered with his grandfather's handwriting. "Protection charms," Thomas read aloud from the note. "Blessed by Father McKenna in 1845, one for each member of the team plus one for the warning boy. If worn during the storm, they may provide some defense against the entity's influence." Dr. Williams examined the buttons with obvious skepticism, but the sound of more children joining the procession outside made him reconsider. "At this point, I'm willing to try anything, but if we're going to do this, we need to gather your entire team first. If the entity is specifically targeting baseball players, then splitting up would be suicide." Thomas looked out the window one more time and saw that the stream of children heading toward the field had grown into a river. At least 50 youngsters were now walking through the storm, drawn by the entity's supernatural call. Among them, he could see several more of his classmates, including some who lived on the far side of town. "There's no time to gather everyone," Thomas said grimly. "By the time we find all our teammates, half the children in Millbrook will be gone." Jimmy stepped forward, his face set with determination despite his obvious terror. "Then we go with whoever we can find. My sister is down there, and I'm not going to let that thing take her." Dr. Williams made a decision that went against every rational instinct he possessed. "Then we go now, before it gets any stronger. But we stick together. We follow the warning boy's guidance if we can see him, and at the first sign that we're in over our heads, we retreat. Thomas distributed the brass buttons among those present, keeping 2 extras in case they found more of his teammates along the way. The moment he pinned the button to his jacket, he felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, and the oppressive weight of the storm's supernatural influence seemed to lift slightly. As they prepared to leave the attic, Thomas took one last look at his grandfather's photographs. In the final image, the one with the terrified expression, the mysterious boy was no longer looking at the camera. Now he appeared to be looking directly at Thomas, and his expression had changed from terror to something that might have been hope. The storm raged outside with increasing fury, but Thomas no longer felt like they were facing it alone. Somewhere in the supernatural chaos of this night, 11 ghostly boys who had died 50 years ago were waiting to help them save the children of Millbrook from the entity that had taken their own lives. The only question was whether they would be in time. The moment they stepped outside the Murphy house, the storm's supernatural fury hit them like a physical blow. The wind howled with voices that sounded disturbingly human, and the rain fell in patterns that seemed to spiral around them, as if the weather itself was alive and watching their movements. The brass buttons on their jackets grew warm against their skin, providing the only comfort in the chaos. Thomas led the group through the streets of Millbrook, following the trail of entranced children who continued their mechanical march toward the old baseball field. Dr. Williams stayed close behind, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest, while Jimmy frantically searched the procession for his little sister, Sarah. As they moved through the town, they encountered more parents who had discovered their missing children. Mrs. Patterson stood in her front yard, screaming her daughter's name into the storm, while Mr. Sullivan chased after his youngest son, only to collapse in exhaustion after 3 blocks. The entity's influence seemed to make the children immune to their parents' calls, and any adult who tried to physically restrain a child found themselves overwhelmed by an inexplicable weakness. "There!" Jimmy shouted over the thunder, pointing ahead to where a small blonde figure walked among the other children. "Sarah!" Jimmy's 7-year-old sister moved with the same eerie synchronization as the others, her nightgown plastered to her small frame by the driving rain. When Jimmy called out to her, she didn't even turn her head, but Thomas noticed that her lips were moving silently, as if she were responding to some voice only she could hear. "Don't touch her yet," Dr. Williams warned as Jimmy started forward. If the entity has her under its influence, breaking that connection suddenly might be dangerous. As they continued following the procession, Thomas began to notice other figures moving through the storm, translucent shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility with each lightning flash. The ghostly forms of children in old-fashioned clothing walked alongside the living youngsters, and Thomas realized with a chill that these were probably the victims from previous decades, still trapped and unable to move on. "Do you see them?" Thomas asked Jimmy, gesturing toward the ghostly figures. Jimmy squinted through the rain and nodded grimly. "How many children has this thing taken over the years?" "Too many," came a voice that seemed to speak directly inside their heads, rather than through their ears. Thomas spun around and found himself face to face with the mysterious boy from the photographs. Up close, the ghostly child looked exactly as he had in the images, perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair and clothing from an earlier era. But his eyes held a weight of sorrow and determination that no living child should possess. "How you can hear me," the boy said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and urgency. "Finally, someone who can hear me." "Who are you?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "My name is Daniel Morrison. I was the first one it took, back in 1820. I've been trying to warn others ever since, but nobody could see me until now." The ghostly boy gestured toward the procession of children ahead of them. "The entity grows stronger with each feeding. Tonight it plans to take every child in Millbrook." Dr. Williams was staring at the apparition, with the expression of a man whose understanding of reality had just been shattered. "This is impossible," he murmured. "I'm a man of science. Ghosts don't exist." "Science doesn't explain everything, Doctor," Daniel Morrison replied sadly. "Some things exist in the spaces between what you understand and what you fear to acknowledge." Thomas felt the brass button on his jacket pulse with warmth. "The buttons my grandfather left. They're allowing us to see and hear you, aren't they? Your grandfather was a wise man. He understood that some battles require more than the living can provide." Daniel's form flickered as another massive lightning strike illuminated the sky. "But we don't have much time. The entity is almost at full power, and once it opens the portal completely, there will be no stopping it. Portal? Jimmy asked, his voice cracking with fear. The entity doesn't belong to this world, Daniel explained as they continued following the children through the storm-lashed streets. It comes from a place of eternal hunger, feeding on the life force of the young. Every 50 years, when the barriers between worlds are thinnest, it can cross over, but it needs a specific ritual to anchor itself here permanently. Thomas felt his stomach drop. What kind of ritual? It needs to consume exactly 100 young souls during a single storm. In 1845, it only managed to take 10 before the storm ended. In 1870, it took 23 children before the town fled. Each time it feeds, it grows stronger and can extend the storm longer. As they reached the outskirts of town, Thomas could see the old baseball field ahead, and what he saw there filled him with absolute terror. The field was surrounded by a swirling vortex of dark clouds that reached from the ground to the sky like a massive tornado. Lightning struck continuously within the vortex, but instead of dissipating, the electrical energy seemed to be feeding into a growing tear in the very fabric of reality at the center of the field. The entranced children were walking directly toward this supernatural phenomenon, and Thomas could see that there were far more than he had initially realized. Children from neighboring towns were also converging on the field, drawn by the entity's expanding influence. "My God," Dr. Williams whispered, "there must be nearly 100 children out there." "Exactly," Daniel Morrison said grimly. "It's been planning this for decades, growing stronger, extending its reach. Tonight is the night it finally achieves its goal." Through the supernatural storm, Thomas could see the ghostly forms of other children, Daniel's companions who had been trying to help him warn the living for 75 years. They stood at the edge of the field, like a spectral army, but they seemed powerless to intervene directly. "Why can't you stop it yourselves?" Thomas asked. "You've had decades to figure out how." "We're trapped between worlds," Daniel explained. "We can observe, we can try to warn, but we cannot act in the physical realm. That's why we've been trying so desperately to reach the living. You and your team are our only hope." Jimmy grabbed Thomas's arm. "Look at the children. They're starting to form a circle." Indeed, as they watched in horror, the 100 or so entranced children began arranging themselves in a perfect circle around the tear in reality at the center of the field. The younger ones, including Jimmy's sister Sarah, were being positioned closer to the center, while the older children formed the outer rings. "It's beginning the ritual," Daniel said, his ghostly form growing more agitated. "Once all the children are in position, the entity will emerge fully into your world. After that, no force on earth will be able to stop it." Thomas felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. "What do we have to do?" "The entity draws its power from the storm and the fear of its victims. If you can break the circle, disrupt the ritual, you might be able to weaken it enough for us to help." Daniel's voice was growing fainter as the supernatural energy around the field intensified. "But Thomas, you have to understand, anyone who enters that circle will be putting their soul at risk. The entity will try to claim you the moment you step onto that field." Thunder crashed overhead with such force that it felt like the sky itself was breaking apart. In the distance, Thomas could see his teammates arriving from different directions, some with their families, others alone. They all wore the same expression of grim determination, mixed with absolute terror. "Then we'd better get started," Thomas said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, "before it gets any stronger." As he stepped toward the field where 100 children stood in supernatural trance, awaiting a fate worse than death, Thomas clutched the brass button on his jacket and hoped that his grandfather's protection would be enough to see them through the nightmare ahead. As Thomas approached the edge of the cursed field, he was joined by his teammates who had managed to find their way through the supernatural storm. Robert Chen arrived with his father, both of them wearing brass buttons that Thomas's mother had quickly fashioned from the remaining charms. The Sullivan twins came running from the east, having escaped their house when their parents fell under the same trance that had affected the other adults. Benjamin Hayes and Samuel Morrison approached from the south, their faces grim with determination. "Is this everyone?" Dr. Williams asked, doing a quick head count. "David and Timothy are still missing," Jimmy replied, scanning the storm-lashed landscape around them. "But we can't wait any longer. Look at the children." The 100 entranced youngsters had now formed a perfect spiral pattern around the tear in reality at the center of the field. The youngest children, including several toddlers who couldn't have been more than 3 years old, stood in the innermost ring, their small faces turned upward toward the swirling vortex of dark energy above. Them, Each successive ring contained slightly older children, with the teenagers forming the outermost circle. It's arranging them by age, Thomas realized with growing horror. The youngest souls first. Daniel Morrison's ghostly form flickered beside them, growing more translucent as the entity's power increased. The ritual requires the purest life force, he explained urgently. It will consume the youngest children first, using their energy to anchor itself more firmly in your world. With each soul it takes, it will become harder to stop. Through the supernatural storm, Thomas could see something emerging from the tear in reality, a darkness so absolute it seemed to absorb the lightning itself. The entity was beginning to manifest physically, and its presence filled the air with a sound like screaming wind mixed with the cries of countless lost children. "My God," Dr. Williams whispered, his scientific worldview crumbling as he witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. "What is that thing?" "Pure hunger," Daniel replied simply. "It has no form of its own, so it takes the shape of its victims' greatest fears. To the children it appears as the monster from their nightmares. To adults it becomes their deepest guilt and regret made manifest." As if responding to Daniel's words, the entity began to take shape. To Thomas it appeared as a massive figure wreathed in storm clouds, with eyes like burning coals and hands that reached down toward the helpless children with fingers made of shadow and lightning. But he could see that his teammates were reacting to different visions. Jimmy was staring at something that looked like a giant version of his abusive uncle, while Robert seemed to be seeing a creature with the face of every person who had ever called him names for being different. "Don't look directly at it," Daniel warned. "It feeds on fear, and the more afraid you become, the stronger it grows. Focus on the children, focus on saving them." Thomas forced himself to look away from the terrifying manifestation and concentrate on the entranced youngsters in the circle. He could see Jimmy's little sister Sarah in the innermost ring, standing next to a small boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Their faces were completely blank, their eyes reflecting the unnatural light of the entity above them. "How do we break the circle without hurting them?" Thomas asked desperately. "You have to get to the center," Daniel replied, his voice growing fainter as the entity's presence increased. "The ritual circle draws its power from the geometric pattern. If you can reach the tear in reality and disrupt the flow of energy, the children should be freed from its influence. But that means going through all those rings of children," Samuel Morrison pointed out. "What if we can't avoid stepping on them?" "The brass buttons will protect you from the entity's direct influence," Daniel assured them, "but they won't make you immune to its physical manifestations. Once you enter that circle, it will try to stop you with everything it has." Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that several of the boys were knocked to their knees. In the center of the field, the entity was growing larger and more solid, its form becoming increasingly distinct as it prepared to begin the feeding ritual. "We have to go now," Thomas declared, surprising himself with his decisiveness. "Whatever happens, we stick together and we don't stop until we reach the center." Dr. Williams grabbed Thomas's shoulder. "Son, I can't let you children do this alone. Whatever that thing is, it's my responsibility as an adult to protect you." "With respect, Dr. Williams, the adults in this town are all under its influence," Thomas replied. "We're the only ones who can move freely, because we're the ones it's been trying to communicate with. You need to stay here and help any children who break free from the circle." Before the doctor could protest further, Thomas stepped onto the cursed field and immediately felt the full weight of the entity's attention focus on him. The air around him became thick and oppressive, making each breath a struggle, and the ground beneath his feet felt like it was trying to pull him down into some bottomless pit. His teammates followed close behind, forming a tight group as they began making their way through the outer rings of entranced children. The teenagers in the outermost circle didn't react to their presence at all, continuing to stare upward at the entity with vacant expressions. But as they moved deeper into the pattern, Thomas began to notice subtle changes in the children's behavior. "They're starting to hum," Jimmy observed, his voice tight with fear. Indeed, a low, harmonious humming had begun to emerge from the throats of all the entranced children. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, but deeply wrong, like a lullaby being sung by voices that belonged to the dead. With each step toward the center, the humming grew louder and more complex, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate in the boys' bones. "It's using their voices to strengthen the ritual," Daniel's fading voice warned them. "The humming is creating vibrations that help tear open the barrier between worlds." As they reached the middle rings of the circle, the entity above them began to take notice of their intrusion. Tendrils of shadow and lightning reached down toward them, but the brass buttons on their jackets flared with protective light, deflecting the supernatural attacks. However, Thomas could feel the charms growing warm against his skin, and he suspected they wouldn't be able to withstand the entity's full power for long. There, Robert pointed toward the center of the circle, where the youngest children stood around the tear in reality. "I can see Sarah." Jimmy's little sister was indeed visible among the toddlers and young children in the innermost ring. Her blonde hair whipped around her face in the supernatural wind, and her small voice added to the chorus of humming that was growing more powerful by the minute. But as they pushed through the remaining rings of children, the entity above them let out a roar of rage that shattered windows in houses a mile away. It had realized what they were trying to do, and it was preparing to stop them with lethal force. "Run!" Thomas shouted, breaking into a sprint, as massive bolts of supernatural lightning began striking the ground all around them. The final 50 yards to the center of the circle became a nightmarish gauntlet of dodging lightning strikes, leaping over cracks that opened in the earth and fighting against winds that tried to lift them off their feet and hurl them back toward the edge of the field. One by one, Thomas's teammates fell behind. First Robert, then Samuel, then Benjamin, until only Thomas and Jimmy remained running toward the center, where the youngest children waited in their supernatural trance. "Tommy!" Jimmy screamed over the chaos. "I can't make it. The lightning's too close." Thomas turned to see his best friend trapped between two massive strikes that had turned the ground around him into molten glass. Jimmy was unhurt, but unable to move forward or backward without stepping into the superheated earth. At that moment, Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his young life: save his best friend or continue toward the center to save all the children. The entity seemed to sense his hesitation, and its attacks intensified, as if it knew that doubt and indecision were its greatest weapons against the living. In the center of the circle, surrounded by the humming voices of 100 entranced children, the tear in reality pulsed with malevolent energy, and something vast and hungry began to push its way through from the other side. Thomas stood frozen for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, torn between his loyalty to Jimmy and his responsibility to all the children trapped in the supernatural circle. The entity above him seemed to feed on his indecision, growing larger and more solid with each moment of hesitation. Then he heard Daniel Morrison's voice, barely a whisper in the supernatural chaos. "Trust your teammates, Thomas. You're not alone in this fight." As if summoned by the ghostly boy's words, the spirits of the 1845 baseball team suddenly became visible around the circle. 10 translucent figures in old-fashioned uniforms materialized near Thomas's trapped teammates, and while they couldn't physically intervene, they began to guide the living boys away from the most dangerous lightning strikes. "Go!" Jimmy shouted from his position between the molten glass. "I'll find another way! Save my sister!" Thomas made his choice and sprinted toward the center of the circle, dodging massive bolts of supernatural lightning that struck the ground with such force they created craters in the earth. The humming of the entranced children grew to a deafening crescendo, and the tear in reality began to widen as something vast and terrible pushed its way through from the other side. As he reached the innermost ring where the youngest children stood, Thomas saw Jimmy's 7-year-old sister Sarah standing directly next to the dimensional tear. Her small face was tilted upward, her mouth open, as she added her innocent voice to the ritual chorus. The sight filled Thomas with a rage that burned hotter than his fear. "Not today," he shouted at the entity, pulling the brass button from his jacket and holding it high above his head. The protective charm blazed with golden light that seemed to push back the darkness surrounding the tear in reality. For a moment, the entity's roar of hunger was replaced by what sounded almost like surprise, as if it had never encountered resistance quite like this before. Thomas reached Sarah and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. The moment he made contact, her humming stopped, and her eyes began to clear from their supernatural trance. Around the circle, other children began to stagger and look around in confusion as the entity's hold on them weakened. "Sarah," Thomas whispered urgently, "you need to run to your brother. Can you do that for me?" The little girl nodded, still dazed, but no longer completely under the entity's control. As she stumbled away from the tear in reality, Thomas could see that his disruption of the ritual was having a cascading effect. Children throughout the circle were beginning to wake from their trance, their voices falling silent one by one. But the entity was not finished. Realizing that its carefully planned ritual was being destroyed, it abandoned all subtlety and began to manifest its full power. The tear in reality exploded outward, and a massive form of living shadow and malevolent energy erupted from the dimensional rift. Thomas found himself face to face with pure evil given form, a creature that seemed to be composed of every nightmare humanity had ever experienced. It towered above him, its eyes burning with the accumulated suffering of all the children it had consumed over the centuries, its voice a chorus of the damned. "How you cannot stop what has already begun," the entity spoke, its words causing the very air to vibrate with malice. "I have fed on innocence for 1,000 years, and I will not be denied by one small boy with a trinket." "Maybe not by one boy," Thomas replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "But what about 11? At his words, Daniel Morrison and the 10 ghostly members of the 1845 team materialized around the tear in reality. Their forms were more solid now, given strength by Thomas's act of courage and the disruption of the entity's ritual. "You took our lives," Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of 75 years of waiting for this moment. "You trapped our souls between worlds. You used our deaths to grow stronger, but this ends tonight." The ghostly boys joined hands around the dimensional tear, forming their own circle of protection. As they did, Thomas felt the brass button in his hand pulse with renewed energy, and he realized that his grandfather's protective charms had been designed for exactly this moment. "The buttons aren't just protection," Thomas shouted over the entity's roars of rage. "They're keys. Grandfather left 11 of them, one for each member of the team that died, plus one for the boy who tried to warn them." Understanding flooded through him as he saw his teammates approaching the center of the circle, each wearing their own protective charm. Even Jimmy had found a way around the molten glass, guided by the spirit of one of the 1845 players, and was running toward them with determination blazing in his eyes. "Together!" Thomas called out to his friends. "The living and the dead working together!" His teammates formed a second circle around the ghostly players, and the moment all 11 brass buttons came within range of each other, they blazed with a light so brilliant it seemed to rival the sun itself. The entity shrieked in pain and rage as the combined power of the protective charms began to force it back toward the dimensional tear. "This is impossible!" the creature howled. "I am eternal! I am inevitable!" "You're a parasite," Daniel Morrison replied calmly, "and parasites can be destroyed when their hosts fight back." The ghostly team began to pull the entity toward the tear in reality, using their own trapped souls as anchors to drag it back to whatever nightmarish dimension it had come from. But the creature fought back with desperate fury, lashing out with tendrils of shadow and lightning that shattered the ground around them. "We can't hold it much longer," Samuel Morrison called out, his voice strained with effort as he maintained his position in the protective circle. Thomas looked around at his teammates, these boys who had started as nothing more than a small-town baseball team, but had become something far greater. They were exhausted, terrified, and facing something beyond their worst nightmares, but none of them had given up. "Then we finish this now," Thomas declared. "Everyone together, push it back." The 11 living boys stepped forward as one, their brass buttons creating a web of protective light that began to compress around the entity. At the same time, the 11 ghostly players pulled from the other side, trapping the creature between two forces it could no longer resist. "You cannot destroy me," the entity screamed as it was forced back toward the dimensional tear. "I will return. I will feed again." "Not if we close the door," Thomas replied, and he threw his brass button directly into the tear in reality. The protective charm blazed like a star as it passed through the dimensional rift, and immediately the tear began to collapse. One by one, his teammates followed his example, throwing their own buttons into the closing portal. The entity's screams grew more distant as it was pulled back to its own realm, its form dissolving as the barrier between worlds reasserted itself. With a sound like the universe taking a deep breath, the tear in reality snapped shut, taking the entity with it. The supernatural storm began to dissipate immediately, the unnatural lightning fading to normal rain, the howling wind settling to a gentle breeze. Around the field, 100 children stood in confused silence, freed from their supernatural trance and wondering how they had come to be standing in a muddy field in the middle of the night. Parents began arriving from all directions, having broken free from their own enchantment the moment the entity was banished. Thomas sank to his knees in exhaustion, only to find Daniel Morrison kneeling beside him. The ghostly boy looked different now, peaceful, complete, no longer trapped between worlds. "Thank you," Daniel said simply. "We can rest now, all of us." One by one, the spirits of the 1845 baseball team began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as they finally found the peace that had been denied to them for 75 years. They smiled at Thomas and his teammates, their expressions filled with gratitude and relief. "Will we see you again?" Thomas asked as Daniel's form began to fade. "In dreams, perhaps," the ghostly boy replied. "Good dreams this time. Dreams of children playing baseball under clear skies the way it's supposed to be." As the last of the ghostly team disappeared into whatever realm awaited them beyond life, Thomas looked around at his teammates and realized that they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had faced pure evil and won, not through strength or magic, but through courage, friendship, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. The nightmare was over, but their story was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the supernatural storm, and Millbrook was slowly returning to normal. The old baseball field had been permanently closed by the town council, who declared it unsafe due to unusual geological instability, an explanation that satisfied most adults who preferred rational reasons for the inexplicable events they had witnessed. Thomas sat on his front porch in the crisp November air, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall from the maple tree in his yard. The brass button was gone, sacrificed to seal the dimensional tear, but he could still feel its warmth sometimes, as if it had left a permanent mark on his soul. Dr. Williams approached up the gravel path, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a man still coming to terms with a world that contained more mysteries than his scientific training had prepared him for. He had become a frequent visitor to the Murphy household since that night, partly to check on Thomas's health, but mostly, Thomas suspected, because the doctor needed to talk to someone who had shared the experience. "How are you feeling today, son?" Dr. Williams asked, settling into the rocking chair beside Thomas. "Different," Thomas replied honestly, "like I'm seeing the world with new eyes. Everything seems brighter somehow, more real." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "The other boys report similar feelings. Jimmy says he's sleeping better than he has in years, no nightmares at all. Robert's parents tell me he's become more confident, more willing to stand up for himself when other children tease him." Thomas wasn't surprised. They had all been changed by their experience, marked by the encounter with something far beyond the normal boundaries of childhood. But unlike the trauma he might have expected, the change felt positive, as if they had been granted some kind of protection or blessing. "Dr. Williams," Thomas said carefully, "do you think it's really over?" The older man was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the peaceful street where children played hopscotch and rolled hoops, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. "I think the immediate threat is gone," he said finally. "That entity was banished, the dimensional tear was sealed, and the spirits of those poor boys from 1845 finally found peace. But Thomas, what you and your teammates accomplished was extraordinary. You proved that ordinary people can face extraordinary evil and prevail." Thomas considered this as he watched Jimmy Patterson approach, with his little sister Sarah skipping beside him. The 7-year-old showed no lasting effects from her supernatural ordeal, though she did occasionally mention dreams about the nice boys who helped her find her way home. "Tommy!" Sarah called out cheerfully as they reached the porch. "Jimmy says you're the bravest boy in all of Pennsylvania." Thomas felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I wasn't brave, Sarah. I was scared the whole time. That's what made it brave," Dr. Williams observed with a smile. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid." Jimmy settled on the porch steps, his face serious despite his sister's cheerful presence. "I've been thinking about that night a lot," he said. "About what Daniel Morrison told us. About how the entity had been feeding for centuries. Do you think there are other places like our field? Other creatures like that thing?" Dr. Williams and Thomas exchanged a meaningful look. It was a question that had occurred to all of them, and one that carried troubling implications. "I suspect there might be," the doctor admitted. "But if there are, then there are also people like you boys who will stand against them. What you accomplished has given me hope that the darkness in this world will always be met by light." As if summoned by their conversation, the rest of the baseball team began arriving at the Murphy house. It had become their informal tradition to gather here on Sunday afternoons, not to practice baseball, but simply to be together, to maintain the bond that had been forged in supernatural fire. Robert Chen arrived with a book about ancient folklore under his arm, having developed a keen interest in studying supernatural phenomena. The Sullivan twins came together as always, but their usual mischievous energy had been tempered by a new sense of responsibility. Benjamin Hayes brought his youngest cousin, a 5-year-old boy who looked up at the older children with obvious admiration. Samuel Morrison was the last to arrive, and Thomas noticed that he carried himself differently now, not just as the team captain, but as someone who had faced ultimate responsibility and proven himself worthy of it. "Any news from Mr. Aldrich?" Samuel asked, settling into the circle they had formed on the porch and in the yard. "He's doing much better, Dr. Williams reported. The nightmares have stopped completely, and he started taking photographs again. He says the camera no longer shows him things that shouldn't be there." Thomas smiled at this news. The photographer had been deeply traumatized by his role in documenting the supernatural events, convinced that his equipment had somehow attracted the entity's attention. It was good to know that he was healing. "What about the photograph?" Robert asked. "The original championship picture. Still hanging in Peterson's store window," Thomas replied, "but it shows exactly what it should now. 10 boys from the Millbrook Cubs baseball team celebrating their county championship. No extra faces, no changing expressions. It's like it never happened," Jimmy mused. "Oh, it happened," Dr. Williams assured them. "The families of those 100 children all remember their youngsters sleepwalking toward the field. The townspeople remember the supernatural storm, but they're able to process it as a natural phenomenon now, rather than something that defied all explanation." Thomas understood what the doctor meant. The adults in Millbrook had found ways to rationalize what they had experienced, filing it away under explanations like mass hysteria or unusual weather patterns. Only the boys who had actually confronted the entity retained clear memories of its true supernatural nature. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to more ordinary topics: school assignments, upcoming holidays, plans for winter activities. But Thomas noticed that even in their casual discussions, his teammates showed a new awareness of the people around them, a heightened sensitivity to others who might be in need of help or protection. When the sun began to set and the other boys prepared to head home for supper, Thomas walked with them to the end of his street. As they stood together under the gas streetlight that had just flickered to life, he realized that their experience had created something precious and permanent. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "we started out as just a baseball team, a group of boys who wanted to win a championship. And we did win," Samuel pointed out with a grin. "We just ended up playing a much bigger game than we expected." Jimmy laughed, the sound carrying none of the fear that had marked their voices 3 weeks earlier. "Do you think we'll ever have to face anything like that again?" "I hope not," Thomas replied honestly. "But if we do, at least we know we can handle it." As his friends scattered toward their respective homes, calling out good-natured farewells and promises to see each other at school the next day, Thomas stood alone under the streetlight and looked up at the clear November sky. The stars shone with a brilliance that seemed somehow more pure than he remembered, and the moon cast gentle shadows that held no hint of supernatural menace. In the distance, he could hear the peaceful sounds of Millbrook settling into evening, families gathering for dinner, dogs barking at passing carriages, the distant whistle of the evening train. It was the sound of a town at peace, a community that had faced darkness and emerged intact. Thomas thought about Daniel Morrison and the other boys from 1845, finally at rest, after 75 years of being trapped between worlds. He hoped they had found the peace they deserved, and he silently promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. As he turned to walk back toward his house, where warm light spilled from the kitchen windows and his mother's voice called him in for supper, Thomas Murphy smiled. He was 10 years old, a member of the county champion Millbrook Cubs baseball team, and a boy who had looked into the face of ultimate evil and helped to defeat it. But most importantly, he was a boy who had learned that the greatest victories come not from individual heroism, but from the courage to stand together with friends when the world needs protecting. The nightmare was over, and the dream of a normal childhood could begin again. But Thomas knew that he and his teammates would always be ready if the darkness ever returned to threaten the innocent. After all, they were more than just a baseball team now. They were guardians of the light,